Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to part two of the Chapter 10 lecture on violent crime. So, again, this is the second half. The first half covered violent crime um, and some crime typologies, specifically focusing on rape and other reasons for or causes of violence, etc. And now we're going to move into the murder or homicide section. So this is part two of the chapter 10 lecture. So let's go ahead and continue on. Um, so murder and homicide is probably good to at least define what it is. So the common law definition of murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. And I want you to kind of think about what malice aforethought means. It is the most serious of crimes here, murder, and one that is punishable by death, which means there's a capital punishment thing there. And malice aforethought also has to do with a word called premeditation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So, Western societies basically abhorrence of murders is illustrated by the fact that there is no statute of limitations on a murder case. Meaning that whereas state laws limit prosecution on other crimes to, let's say, a fixed period of time, maybe like 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, accused killers can be brought to justice at any time after their crimes were committed. And you see this a lot of times with some of these bigger cases that are out there. And one thing that comes to light that the book doesn't talk a lot about, but I want to make sure that we understand, there are actually law enforcement sections within their homicide unit that's called a cold case unit. And you're seeing more and more of these units where they're going back and they're starting to look at cases that have basically gone cold, meaning that all leads have really been exhausted and there was no more evidence to continue towards the path of prosecution, if that makes any sense. So cold case units are kind of an up and coming thing. So, okay, so now back to the murder homicide. So to legally prove that a murder has taken place, most state jurisdictions require the prosecutor to show that the accused maliciously intended to kill the victim. And express or actual malice is the state of mind assumed to exist when someone kills another person in the absence of any other type of provocation. So implied or constructive malice, again, is considered to exist when a death results from negligent or unthinking behavior. And in your textbook, in the column on the left and the right outside of the main text, you'll see a lot of definitions. And I would really think it would be good for you to read and understand a lot of those different definitions because it can get a little confusing. So, express or actual malice is that state of mind assumed to exist when somebody kills someone else in absence of some other provocation. So that's express malice. Now, implied or constructive malice is considered to exist when that death results from a negligent or unthinking behavior. So all of these are important to you as an officer, as a criminologist, and as a prosecutor to determine, because some of these things are going to require express malice and some are going to require implied malice. So now let's look directly at the differences when it comes to like first and second degree murder. So there are different levels or degrees of homicide. First degree murder occurs when a person kills another after premeditation or deliberation. So remember I asked you to look at the terms: premeditation, considering the criminal act beforehand, which suggests that it was motivated by more than a simple desire to engage in some act of violence. You thought about it before, or you planned it. Deliberation, planning a criminal act after careful thought rather than carrying it out on impulse. So, back up again. First-degree murder occurs when a person kills another after premeditation and deliberation. Premeditation means the killing was considered beforehand. Deliberation means the killing was planned after careful thought rather than on impulse. To constitute deliberate and premeditated killing, the suspect must weigh and consider the question of killing and the reasons for and against such a choice. Having in mind the consequences, he or she decides and does kill. The planning implied by this definition need not be a long process. It may almost be instantaneous decision to take another life. Also, a killing that accompanies a felony, such as a robbery or rape, usually constitutes first-degree murder. And they call it the felony murder rule. So if you look at your definitions again, felony murder, a killing that accompanies a felony, such as robbery. So if someone commits a robbery and during the robbery a person is killed, that activates what they would call the felony murder, or in California, the felony murder rule. Does that kind of make sense? Now, second-degree murder requires the killer to have malice aforethought, but not premeditation or deliberation. So you can kind of see the difference there. A second-degree murder occurs when a person's wanton disregard for the victim's life and his or her desire to inflict serious bodily harm on the victim results in the victim's death. Now, there's a little bit more that goes with it, okay? So we're talking about degrees of murder. So we have first and second degrees, and in some states it's different, but there are other levels. So let's keep going. Homicide without malice is called manslaughter and is usually punished by anywhere from 1 to 15 years in prison. So manslaughter, this is homicide without malice. So if you go back, I know it's confusing, when you look at first and second degree, they have malice, okay, but again, here's a homicide. This is a death without malice. So we have manslaughter, okay, and there's two types of manslaughter. So bear with me, again, technical. Voluntary or non-negligent manslaughter refers to a killing committed in the heat of passion or during a sudden quarrel that provoked violence. Although intent may be present, malice is not. And involuntary or negligent manslaughter refers to a killing that occurs when a person's acts are negligent and without regard for the harm they may cause others. So most involuntary manslaughter cases involve things like motor vehicle deaths, or a drunk driver kills a pedestrian or something like that. And then the last one, they call it deliberate indifference. This is met when a person knows and disregards or ignores an excessive risk to another's health or safety. So again, you have all these different definitions, and I know that it's kind of tough, but that's where you want to take the time to read through your key terms so you know the difference. Now, one thing I did put in here for you it's California, but I want you to understand, and this isn't a criminal law course, homicide is the big umbrella at the top. And underneath homicide, you have murder, which it's going to be unlawful, and you have first and second degree. And here it even tells you, for first degree murder, you need expressed malice. And if you go down here, deliberate intent to take the life of another. Second degree would be implied. No considerable provocation. So it's kind of telling you what it is. Here are the crimes that kind of encompass first degree. And then here are second. And then you still have different types of death. Remember, homicide is the top. Murder is the unlawful. Then you have deaths. You have lawful, meaning you have like justifiable homicide, excusable homicide, and then you have what we just talked about. You have manslaughter. It's unlawful, and it gives you definitions of each. And then there's a separate one called vehicular manslaughter in California. So I hope this chart kind of helps break it up and adds a little bit of context to what we're talking about. So now back to murder and homicide in looking at, let's say some of the numbers. Since 1991, the murder rate has been steadily declining. It does tend to be an urban crime. Victims and offenders tend to be males. About half of murder victims are African American. About 1/3 of victims and half of the offenders tend to be under 25 years of age. Now, what's kind of a little bit more scary, if that's a proper way of saying that, is these are what we call crime clocks, and these are published by the FBI as part of the UCR, which is where every police department in the United States has to report certain crime stats to the FBI, and the UCR is the report that they publish. And they tell you different types of crimes, part 1 crimes actually is what they're called, by time. So if we look at 2017, which is the latest data that we have, a violent crime occurs about every 24.6 seconds across the United States. One murder every 30.5 minutes. That's pretty scary. So I wanted to show you that. You can find those on the FBI website if you want to look at those. But it's important that you do know the rate of some of these crimes, even though they have been going down over several years. And one kind of cool case study is, when you talk about murder and homicide, a lot of offenders tend to have long criminal careers, and here we have some information on the Zodiac killer, which is kind of cool. And one thing, the Zodiac killer, he was directly linked to at least 5 murders in Northern California in 1968 and 1969, and he may have been responsible for more. And he actually taunted police and made threats through letters sent to the area newspapers from about 1969 to 1974. Before stopping all the communication. And despite intensive investigations, no one was ever arrested for the crimes. And that case is a cold case. It remains open, but it's actually considered to be a cold case. Now, on August 1st, a little bit more, 1969, the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, they each received an identical handwritten letter in an envelope with a return address beginning, "Dear editor, I'm the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman. The letters contain details from the Zodiac killer's murders that only that person would know." And the killer went on to threaten further attacks if the letters were not printed on the front page of the papers. And each letter closed with a symbol consisting of a circle with a cross through it, in what would become to known as the Zodiac killer symbol. And the letters were also accompanied by one part of a 3-part like notebook or cipher that he claimed contained his identity. And while Bay Area police departments and the FBI worked feverishly to track this guy down, another letter soon arrived at the San Francisco Examiner beginning, "Dear editor," this is the Zodiac speaking. It also described the murders in detail and actually taunted the police for not having been able to crack this code or this case. And several days later, a high school teacher, Donald Hardin, and his wife, Betty, were able to solve this cipher. It was like a code that said, "I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is most of all the most dangerous animal of all." And here's a picture of the code. And this was actually published in the paper. So again, these are kind of interesting cases to take a look at. So 3 days after the 4th known killing, the 1969 murder of a taxi driver, the Chronicle received a letter claiming the crime. and written in the same erratic print as the Zodiac's previous letters. It gave the details of the murder and was accompanied by a bloody scrap of the victim's shirt. And at the end of the letter, the killer basically said that he would next shoot out the tire of a school bus and pick off the kiddies kind of one at a time as they came bouncing out of the vehicle. And the Zodiac killer continued with his correspondence with Bay Area papers, and he included more ciphers claiming to have committed several more murders and mocked the police, etc. And in 1974, the letter stopped. Again, although the investigation has not, and I included a larger picture so you can see one of the ciphers and the codes and a couple of videos that if you want to take the time you could look at. But these are, again, interesting cases when you talk about killings. And this is an example of a cold case. So, talking about the nature of and extent of murder, and now looking at different types, if you will, we're going to start off with what we call murderous relations. Now, most murders are what we call expressive. That is, they're motivated by rage or anger, and they typically involve friends, relatives, and acquaintances. Stranger homicides typically involve commission of another crime, such as like robbery, rape, or a drug deal, where the suspect applied, let's say, too much force in completing their crime. So that kind of makes sense. Now, murderous relations are also shaped by gender. Males are more likely to kill others of similar social standing in more public context, whereas women kill family members and intimate partners in private settings or private locations. And what forms do murderous relations take? Well, let's kind of look at a couple of different ones. So now that we're going to talk about it, I have a couple of photos here of the crime scene surrounding Robert Blake's wife's murder. And again, a very interesting case if you want to take the time to look at it. But many murders involve husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends, and others involved in romantic relationships. Intimate partner murder is a gendered phenomenon. When women commit homicide, the most likely victim is an intimate partner. About 40% of all female homicide incidents involve killing a male partner. However, while less than 10% of all murders committed by men involve a female partner, intimate partner homicides make up 40 to 50% of all murders of women in the United States. So men who kill romantic partners typically have a long history of violence, while for women, killing their partners may be their first violent offense. This may be the reason that there is what they call a chivalry effect in domestic violence murders. In death penalty states like California, the death sentence rate for single victim domestic violence murders is significantly lower than the overall death sentence rate for other kinds of killings. And not surprisingly, when women in these states are found guilty of capital murder, they are far less likely to be sentenced to death compared to that of men. So, intimate partner murder. Another subcategory in here would be what we call acquaintance murder. And most murders occur among people who are acquainted, although on the surface the killing might seem senseless. It is often the result of a long simmering dispute motivated by revenge, dispute resolution, jealousy, drug deals, racial bias, or threats to identity or status. A prior act of violence motivated by profit or greed, such as when a buyer robs his dealer during a drug transaction, may also generate a revenge killing. So kind of an interesting thing. So how do these murderous relationships develop between two people who may have had little or no contact? Well, in a classic study, David Luckenbill examined murder transactions to determine whether particular patterns of behavior are common between the killer and the victim. And he found that many homicides follow a sequential pattern. First, the victim makes what the offender considers to be an offensive move. The offender typically retaliates verbally or physically. An agreement to end things violently is forged with the victim's provocative response. The battle ensues then, leaving the victim dead or dying. The offender's escape is shaped by his or her relationship to the victim or by the reaction of the audience, if any. So again, acquaintance murders. Next would be stranger murders. About 20% of all murders involve strangers. Stranger homicides occur most often as felony murders during things like rapes or robberies and burglaries. Others are random acts of urban violence that fuel public fear. A homeowner tells a motorist to move his car because it's blocking the driveway. An argument ensues. The owner gets a gun and kills the motorist. Stranger homicides can result from random gang violence. Someone is killed inadvertently in a drive-by shooting. They may also stem from things like hate crimes that we'll talk about in a couple other chapters, directed at victims merely because of their race, class, gender, etc. So again, this is stranger murders. Sexually based murders. Some murders are sexually related. Research indicates that sexually related homicide can take a variety of different forms. And while we're not going to go into each one of these individually, we'll at least list them. So there's domestic disputes, and you kind of know what that is. Love triangles involving, let's say, former husbands or wives or jilted lovers. Rape-oriented assault. Lust murders that are motivated by obsessive sexual fantasies. Vengeance for sexual violence. In these cases, someone exacts vengeance on a sexual violence perpetrator, either on his own or on behalf of a sexual violence victim. And then finally, self-defense during sexual violence. In these incidents, sexual violence was taking place and the victim defended herself or himself, resulting in the death of the suspect. So these are things that fall into the area of sexually based murders. Now, kind of keeping along with this theme, asphyxiation is a frequent method of killing, although knives and blunt instruments are also weapons of choice, and it's not uncommon for the sexual killer to use excessive force and even mutilation. Also, not all sexual-based murders involve sex. These killers display things like behavior problems, were poor achievers, and even experienced social isolation. So all of these different things kind of come into play as we're talking about sexually based murders. And here's a couple of photographs of some killings that are kind of chilling if you look at those. School murders. Sadly, violence in schools has become commonplace. There have been a number of mass killings mass killings, such as the 1999 shooting at Columbine High School in Colorado that resulted in the deaths of 15 people, and the Newtown, Connecticut massacre in 2012, in which Adam Lanza killed 20 children and 6 staff members. On average, about 25 students are killed each year at school on the way to or returning from regular sessions at school, or while attending or traveling to and from official school-sponsored events. And school massacres tend to be committed by white males, but the presence of female perpetrators is not unknown, especially when the attack is not carried out with a firearm, but with a knife or some other type of incident. So school shooters, we have to kind of understand that. And we also know that in some of these school shooting incidents, in most of them, about 55%, some type of note, threat, or other action indicating risk of violence occurred before the actual event. And a lot of these shooters are also likely to have expressed some form of suicidal behavior, um, and have been bullied by their peers. And when a lot of criminologists do interviews with these individuals, that information typically does come out. And you can look at the issue, you can look at the Columbine in the upper right. You can look at the, Adam Lanza, the motive for all these different types of school shootings. And most of them talk about things that have happened in their past. Okay, so now what about like serial killers or mass murderers or spree killers? So for years, citizens of Wichita, Kansas lived in fear of the serial killer described as the BTK, or what was called blind, torture, and kill. And during his murder spree, the BTK killer sent taunting letters and packages to the police and the media. And suddenly, after committing gruesome killings in the 1970s, he went underground and disappeared from view. Then, after 25 years of silence, he renewed contact with a local news station. His last communication contained a computer disk which was analyzed by the FBI and traced to 59-year-old Dennis Rader, who later confessed to 10 murders in an effort to escape the death penalty. So now again, we're going to talk about different types of killers, and we're going to start with serial killers. Criminologists consider serial killers such as Rader to be a person who kills 3 or more persons in 3 or more separate events. And in between the murders, a serial killer is going to revert back to his or her normal lifestyle. Serial killers come from all walks of life, though the majority are white. Approximately 17% of all serial homicides in the United States are committed by women, and 20% by African Americans. Most serial killers are solo males, though there are also solo female and partnered offenders. Female serial killers are typically white, educated, and have been married and held a caregiving role like a healthcare worker or a nurse or something. About 40% have had some form of mental illness. So again, the question is, why do they kill? Well, usually for financial gain. They tend to poison a family member or a friend in order to collect an inheritance or insurance policy. They target people who have little chance of fighting back, like children or the elderly or those with diseases or that are sick or that are infirmed. So, when you talk about female serial killers especially, and here you have a picture of John Wayne Gacy, and if you don't like clowns, you're not going to like this guy, and Aileen Wuornos. Both are interesting serial killer cases. So what about some types of serial killers? So some experts have attempted to classify the serial killers on the basis of their motivation and offense patterns. So according to James A. Fox and Jack Levine, there are at least 3 different types of serial killers. The first one is the thrill killer. And this is someone who strives for either sexual sadism or dominance. They enjoy the thrill, the sexual gratification and dominance over their victims. They rarely use a gun because that's too quick and that would deprive them of pleasure. There's mission killers who want to reform the world or have a vision that somehow drives them to kill. And then there's the expedience killers. These are the ones that are out for profit or want to protect themselves from some type of perceived threat. So again, kind of an interesting thing. And if you look on page 341 in your textbook under Exhibit 10.2, you'll see some myths and realities regarding serial killers. So now that we've talked about that, let's move on to mass murderers. So in contrast to serial killers or killings, mass murder, such as the mass shooting by James Holmes, who killed 12 people at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado on July 20th, 2012, involves the killing of 4 or more victims by one or a few assailants within a single event. So we're talking not a bunch of events, a single event. And if you look the same information, if you look on page 343 in Exhibit 10.3, it will show you some information or give you some information on some different mass killings. And we talked about James Holmes in his particular mass killing. And I also put in some information on this one because it's another interesting case, again, that talks about mass killing. There's a PDF of this guy's notebook. We talked about how sometimes there's a precursor, but this person planned this out, had a notebook, made some drawings, a bunch of comments and things that you can look at that really talk about how he was going to carry out his particular crimes. So, Fox and Levine also define 4 types of mass murderers, and we'll talk about each one just briefly. First is revenge killers. These are those individuals that want to get even with people or society at large. Their typical target is an estranged wife and her children, or an employer and his employees. There's love killers that are motivated by a kind of a warped sense of devotion. They are often despondent individuals who commit suicide and take others, such as the wife and children, with them. And then there's the profit killer, that this person is usually trying to cover up a crime, eliminate a witness, or carry out some type of criminal conspiracy for profit. And then finally, the last one would be the terrorist killer. And these are the ones that are trying to send a message. And, this could be like gang killings to tell rivals to watch out. Cult killers may actually leave a message behind to warn society about pending doom. And you can look at some of the pictures. While they're not that, they're pretty disgusting, I guess is a good way to put it, but it sends a message. The one on top was a Colombian individual who basically ratted off a group of drug dealers, and they're sending the message that this is what's going to happen to you. The same with hanging people over a bridge or something high to where people can see them in public, and it sends that public message. So what kind of killer was Charles Manson? And I just threw that out there for you to kind of think about when we talk about the different kinds of killers and things like that. And when we're done, see if you can put him into a category. So next we'll talk about spree killers. So unlike mass murderers, spree killing is not confined to a single outburst, and unlike serial killers, spree killers do not return to normal identities in between killings. Spree killers engage in a rampage of violence over a period of days or even weeks. And the most notorious spree killing to date occurred in 2002 in the Washington, D.C. area, where John Lee Malvo, a Jamaican citizen, and his traveling companion, John Allen Muhammad, an Army veteran with an expert's rating in marksmanship, went on a rampage and left 10 people dead. Some spree killers also target a specific group or class. So it's kind of important that we know that. But again, unlike mass murderers, these type of killers, it's not just one outburst, and they don't go back to doing their normal stuff during the time between killings. They just continue to do it. A killer of multiple victims whose murders occur over a relatively short span of time, and they don't really have a pattern in a sense, but they don't stop until pretty much they're caught. And the DC sniper case was exactly one of those. And again, if you don't know this case, basically what they did is this car, the trunk was cleaned out, and the shooter would lay in the back seat, and there was a hole back here, and they would stick the barrel of the gun out there, and they would park the car in a certain direction, and they would shoot out of the trunk of the car, and nobody could see them. That's why they couldn't catch them for so long. So again, those are the differences in those types of things. So we're going to finish up. We're going to talk about assault and battery, and then we'll look at dating violence, and we'll be done. Although many people mistakenly believe the phrase assault and battery refers to a single act, they're actually two separate crimes. So battery requires the offense of touching, such as slapping, hitting, or punching someone. And assault requires no actual touching, but involves either the attempted battery or the intentional frightening of the victim by word or deed. And although common law originally intended these two crimes to be misdemeanors, more jurisdictions now upgrade them to felonies, either when a weapon is used or when they occur during the commission of a felony, like if someone is assaulted during a robbery or something like that. So there are different types of assaults, kind of like we've talked about with homicides and stuff. And the first one we're going to talk about will be acquaintance and family assaults. So violent attacks in the home are one of the most frightening types of assault. And criminologists recognize that assault among friends and intimates and within the family has become an enduring social problem in the United States and even abroad. And what forms do these attacks kind of take? So when we start talking about these, well, the first one would be child abuse. One area of intra-family violence that has received a great deal of media attention is child abuse, and this term describes any physical or emotional trauma inflicted on a child for which no reasonable explanation, such as an accident or ordinary discipline, can be found. So that's one type of issue there. You may even have neglect and child neglect. So another form of abuse results from neglect, meaning not providing a child with the care and shelter to which they are actually entitled to. You may have parental abuse. Parents are sometimes the target of abuse from their own children. We know that. Spousal abuse. This has occurred throughout recorded history, and by the let's say 19th century, severe wife beating fell into disfavor, and accused wife beaters were subject to things like public ridicule. Nonetheless, this type of crime, if you will, has morphed over the years. The consequences of abuse can be significant, ranging from physical injury to psychological trauma or exposure to sexually transmitted disease. And moreover, physical abuse is commonly accompanied by mental abuse and coercion that can have long-term damaging and even psychological effects. There's dating violence. So date rape is not only the form of violence aimed at a boyfriend or girlfriend. A significant portion of all teens have been the target of dating violence, and it is estimated that one high school girl in 5 may suffer from sexual or physical abuse from a boyfriend. And dating violence has also been linked to substance abuse, unsafe sex, and even eating disorders. And an emerging form of emotional abuse that's kind of coming around now is called relational aggression, in which a partner tries to damage a person's relationship with friends by spreading smears and false rumors, or by revealing information or images that were intended to be private. So this is all part of the section that fits right in here. Robbery, again, talking about crimes of violence and stuff like that. As we're finishing up, the definition of robbery is the taking or attempting to take anything of value from the care, custody, or control of a person or persons by force or threat of force or violence, or by putting the victim in fear. The FBI records about 327,000 robberies per year at a rate of 102 per 100,000 population. And remember, on the right, we talked about the FBI putting out these crime clocks. Well, you can see that there's, we looked at the murder one, we look at robbery every 1.6 minutes across the United States. So, and there's different types of robberies, from bank robberies with explosives. And I'm just showing you some different photos so you can see different types, specifically more high profile bank robberies. When we talk about robbers in action, even though most robbers may be opportunistic rather than professional, robberies still demonstrate rationality and planning. Marcus Felsen describes robbers as foragers, predators who search for their victims, preferably close to their homes where numerous victims are abundant, where the robbers know the territory so they can prey on the people that they're going to rob, and where their victims may be less vigilant because they're on their home turf. So if that kind of makes sense. And that goes along with how they choose their targets. In their important book called Armed Robbers in Action, Stick-Ups and Street Culture, Richard Wright and Scott Decker interviewed active robbers in St. Louis, Missouri, and found that robbers are, in fact, rational decision makers who look for easy prey. One ideal target is the married man who is looking for, let's say, illicit sex, and hires a prostitute, only to be robbed by the prostitute and her pimp. The robbers know that this victim will probably not be inclined to call the police and bring attention to the crime that he was going to get involved in, which is prostitution. And Wright and Decker also found that most armed robberies are motivated by the pressing need for cash, which I totally can understand how that one would play out as well. So what about targets? So how do robbers target individuals? Some robbers target fellow criminals, for example, drug dealers, because they're inviting targets. Although these targets may be dangerous, robbers recognize that people with dirty hands are also unlikely to call police and get entangled in the law. When Bruce Jacobs interviewed armed robbers, he found some specialized in targeting drug dealers because they believed that even though their work was hazardous, the rewards outweighed the risks. So again, kind of an interesting type thing when you look at, you have robbers robbing the other robbers. Acquaintance robbery. Some robbers target people that they know, and this is a phenomenon referred to as acquaintance robbery. And this seems kind of puzzling because victims can easily identify their attackers and report them to police. However, despite this threat, acquaintance robbery may be attractive for a number of reasons. And typically because victims are reluctant to report. Some are motivated by street justice. The robbers know there will be a good take, and victims are often convenient targets. So all of these things kind of fall into play on robberies. There's carjackings that falls into the robbery realm. We can see this element of rationality and planning in the stages of one type of robber who steals cars, in a carjacker, who attacks occupied vehicles for the purpose of theft. So carjacking is not necessarily a random event committed by amateurs, but is carefully planned and carried out by experienced criminals. So carjacking is in fact a form of robbery. And then what about hate crimes? So hate crimes or bias crimes are violent acts directed towards a particular person or members of a group merely because the targets share a discernible racial, ethnic, religious, or gender characteristic. And such crimes range from desecration of a house of worship to a cemetery to even racially motivated murder. And when you talk about the roots of hate, why people commit these biased crimes, what motivates someone like Dylan Roof to kill, in a series of research studies that were done, Jack Devitt, Jack Levine, and Susan Bennett identified 4 motivations for hate crimes. The first is thrill seeking. So in the same way some kids get together to shoot hoops, these individuals get together to commit their crime. Reactive, meaning defensive. Perpetrators of these crimes rationalize their behavior as a defensive stand taken against outsiders whom they believe threaten their community or way of life. Mission or least common. Some disturbed individuals see it as their duty to rid the world of evil. those on a mission, if you will, such as like skinheads or the KKK or white supremacist groups or things like that. And then retaliatory. These offenses are committed in response to a hate crime, either real or perceived, where the original incident actually occurred is irrelevant. Sometimes a rumor of an incident may cause a group of offenders to exact vengeance, if you will, even if the original information was unfounded or inaccurate. So, again, hate crimes are violent acts directed towards a particular person or members of a group because the target shares that discernible characteristics. Okay, so person or a place, it can be either. The nature and extent of hate crimes, well, at last count, law enforcement agencies receive reports of about 6,000 hate crimes each year from about 7,000 victims. However, according to the NCVS, the official reports significantly undercount the actual incidence of hate crimes. Victims report almost 300,000 violent and property hate crimes each year. Most are motivated by race, actually about 50%. When you talk about controlling hate crimes today, almost every state has enacted some form of legislation to combat hate crime. And in that same FBI report that's published every year on crime stats, if you look to the right here, this one was from 2015, it gives you a breakdown. This came from the hate crime statistics that the FBI keeps track of every year, and you can see what category each one of those percentages fall into. A couple of quick contemporary issues and we'll wrap it up. Free speech. Should symbolic acts of hate, such as drawing a swastika or burning a cross, be banned? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court helped answer this case back in the case in 2003 of Virginia versus Black. Kind of an interesting case. Basically, they talked about this was a cross-burning case. So let me kind of go back to it, and I can give you, when it upheld a Virginia statute making it a felony for any person with the intent of intimidating any group or person to burn a cross on the property of another, a highway, or a public place, and specifies that any such burning shall be prima facie evidence of an intent to intimidate that person or group. In its decision, the court upheld Virginia's law, which criminalized cross burning. So again, there have been legislative efforts to kind of deal with that. Workplace violence is now considered the second leading cause of occupational injury or death. This is someone who engages in workplace violence, or who is someone that would do that. The typical offender is a middle-aged white male who faces termination in a worsening economy. So a lot of issues there. Stalking, another complex phenomenon called stalking, can be defined as a course of conduct that is directed at a specific person and involves repeated physical or visual proximity, non-consensual communication, or verbal or written or implied threats sufficient to cause fear in a reasonable person. And stalkers do use a number of strategies. They use surveillance and what they call life invasion, like looking at people's phone calls or emails, intimidation, and even what they call sabotage. So this is kind of a big thing that's taking place now as well. All right, a lot of information. We made it through the 60-minute thing for part 2. So remember, this was the second half of chapter 10. Please take the time to look at the keywords, the definitions, if you will, in Canvas and also at the end of your textbook. And then also review the questions as well that are located at each chapter, at the end of each chapter, to kind of get your juices flowing as well. So with that being said, that'll end part 2 of chapter 10. Until next time.